I just want a general consensus from a couple of people in the room. What do you know about Scott County's African American history? Yes, just what you have learned over the years and what you see as being African American history in Scott County.
Well, the first thing that came to mind for me, I used to live out towards Newtown Pike, not too far from New Zion.
Mm-hmm.
And so I became acquainted with the history of that hamlet, which is something that not a lot of people are familiar with. Is it a neighborhood? Is it a village? Is it a city, a township, a hamlet? I found that kind of unique. And I know there were several others formerly, established by freedmen, hamlets, and tiny settlements around. But New Zion was the first that came to mind.
Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
We know some of the locations from a scavenger hunt we had,
Right.
so we know there's some.
Okay. Well, actually, Scott County had I've got my number here, 17 almost African American hamlets at one time. They were throughout the county. I know that most people are familiar with the Boston community. Me and different African American historians kind of not agree on the date that Boston was established, but you have hamlets throughout the city. Some of the hamlets, Clabber Bottom, that's off Lemons Mill Road. I had a great uncle, Julius Jenkins, who lived out in Clabber Bottom. You have Zion Hill, which is Woodford County, Scott County, Woodford County by Weisenberger Mill. You have that community. Of course, he mentioned New Zion. I'm a blessed woman because I grew up in a African American hamlet, I like to call them, because to me, I decided a hamlet was a safe place. Sounds better than a village. If you all know Miss Willa Gentry, Railford Gentry, she'll disagree with me on that. She thinks villages are the proper name for African American settlements because that was the Africanized name. They called them villages. Like I said, I prefer a hamlet because I'm a product of a hamlet. And what I felt as a little girl growing up in Stonetown in Stamping Ground, Kentucky, I was safe. I wasn't exposed to everything that was going on in the world. So to continue the hamlets, New Zion, like I said, I'm blessed. I grew up in Stonetown, but I live in New Zion now. So that tradition, I love that part of my life. Watkinsville, which is off of Woodlake Road from Stamping Ground going to Frankfort. There's also White Sulphur, which we're all Scott County. We know where the White Sulphur area is. But with me doing research, I realized White Sulphur area did come down Pea Ridge Road. Pea Ridge was an African American settlement. That's where my mother was born and raised. My grandparents actually lived in the Rosenwald School. My mother grew up in the Rosenwald School. They have it as the Rosenwald School at Watkinsville, but the Rosenwald School was actually bought by my great-grandfather, Robert Carter, because the family story says my grandmother Maggie was spoiled. Even though she was married, she lived on Pea Ridge Road and it was a duplex. Her parents lived in one side. She and her husband and their young children lived on the other side. But when they closed the Rosenwald School further down Pea Ridge, she wanted that for her home. So her father, being a great father, bought the house for my grandparents, and my great uncles and my grandfather went in and partitioned the old school off and made it a livable home. So my mother grew up in the old Rosenwald School that was at Watkinsville, but was on Pea Ridge. But unfortunately, the 1974 tornado destroyed that building. But the memory of it is still there. It's down a lane. And as a little girl playing up in that lane, I heard stories about another African American settlement that sat kind of behind where the Rosenwald School sat, my grandparents' house. That was called Blackburn Town. My Aunt Betty, which I have to do an oral history interview with, she has memories of being a little girl growing up right there on Pea Ridge, down the lane, going back and seeing like remnants of old homes. She said blue flowers were different places. She could see where the door frames were still there, remnants of fencing. So as you all know, when you're a historian and you're into history and genealogy, your work is never done. So I've got to find out more about what happened at Blackburn Town, where it was like the people just left overnight. So that's something that I want to research. Um Stonetown, of course, is in Stamping Ground, beautiful Stamping Ground, Kentucky, on Stonetown Road. It was a historic African American settlement. And throughout Locust Fork Road, Main Street in some areas, and going up Wood Lake Road in Stamping Ground, there were Black citizens that lived along those areas. Also, we have Cranetown. I found out my great-grandmother was from Cranetown. I think that's out toward Dry Run, Dry Ridge, Dry Run Baptist Church and Dry Run Church up that area of the county. We have Boydstown. We had Cartertown, which I need to find out. Information's limited, but where there's a will, there's a way, and we know you can find one piece of information that will change the whole ball game when you're working with history. My grandmother's maiden name was Carter, so I'm like, ooh, of course the bells go off with me wanting to know the history of that. There was a huge African American population also at Gray Crossing. Sadieville, because we know Sadieville had a Rosenwald school. There was African American population in Sadieville. Hummingtown, which Dr. Apple, if you want to chime in with location of some of these places, chime in. And Flintroy, which I figured was over on Flintroy Street. That was African American settlement. Kellytown. And there was a Black town and a pension. So I don't know if that was like old U.S. colored troops that maybe all had received pension and moved there. But my work is not finished yet. I still have a lot of work to do. And I mentioned the Rosenwald School at Watkinsville that was actually on Pea Ridge. There was a Rosenwald School in Sadieville. There was a Rosenwald School in Zion Hill, New Zion, Boston, Boydtown, and Great Crossing. There were 6 Rosenwald schools in Scott County. Now, the one in Sadieville, I was fortunate to work with the former city clerk there, Cindy Foster, and she went through the whole process of getting that school restored. And I haven't been to Sadieville in a while, but that would definitely, Glenn told me it had to be Georgetown. And we talked about wanting to bring in some Scott County sites. But since it was the Georgetown 250th, I decided to stay with sites in Georgetown. But I think to fill in more places, the Rosenwald School in Sadieville should be definitely on our tour next year when we have it, because Rosenwald schools were, throughout the South. And they were very instrumental in bringing formal education to freed African Americans. And the Filson 2 years ago had an exhibit, and there was a photographer. And he had went around throughout the southern states and photographed some of the Rosenwald schools. Fisk University in Nashville has like most of the records of the Rosenwald schools. And it's very important because I'm going off topic a little bit. I'm on the Nicodemus, Kansas Historical Society. We have a quarterly newsletter. My assignment for this quarter's article was to write on early education in Scott County. Where do you go? Dr. Apple, Ann Bevins, Rick Johnston wrote a book. Well, several, but they talked about the Rosenwald schools, of course, the Boston School, which is the Chambers Avenue School, which started out as a school by the Freedmen's Bureau. It was the American Missionary School, and it was a colored school that started in 1866. So my knowledge and knowing how on a plantation, which Kentucky doesn't like to use the word plantation, but on a farm that had slaves, it was really up to the slave owner or the slave owner's wife or someone in that family prior to the end of the Civil War and slaves being free, whether or not those slaves got educated. So that's why I'm like, that article is going to be a little hard for me to write, because that's dependent upon what plantation and what slave owner decided, well, yeah, I want my slaves to know to read. So that article got postponed because I have to do more research. But I always reference Dr. Apple's book because that's when I learned about the Freedman School and how the education process has changed. We know that Ed Davis still is in Boston, and we have the park, and we have the Ed Davis Learning Center. But the origins of formal education for African Americans started about 1866. So Ed Davis, the playground and all that would definitely be on our tour, because you have the long history of being one of the first formal schools, but you also have the history of it being the only African American high school in the county. You had schools, colored schools in Stamping Ground. My uncle Lawrence Young Jr. told me a story of how some of the boys, they were older, getting an education, would, in the wintertime, they didn't want to get to school too first because the first one would have to start the fire in the stove. So they'd wait, if they could see when the smoke started coming out the chimney, they would go on to school because somebody else had already did that hard work. My grandmother on my mother's side, who was the Carter, her family was around White Sulphur. She attended an African American school, but it was over in the land in front of the old Watkinsville church. So we have these remnants of places that are far gone, but they mean so much to society, not just African American society. Any educator, would have an interest in the early schools of the county. The school at Stamping Ground was on Locust Fork Road. That's the one my uncle slept in to wait till he saw the smoke coming out the chimney. As a young girl growing up, I remember that house is where the Crittenden family lived, but it was the old school. And I do have a picture of some of the adults in that old school during that time. And we talked about the Boston School. The beautiful thing about Scott County is slavery was harsh and it was unjust, but for the majority of African Americans that were enslaved in Scott County, I don't want to say they didn't have it as harsh as some slaves on other plantations, because slavery itself is harsh. There were slaves murdered here like anywhere else, but the slaves in our county were more skilled slaves as opposed to some other slaves in southern states. Now, the skill level really was what was needed. Earlier before the meeting, we had talked about Monk Estill, who's the famous African American explorer that led people through the Yeah, Cumberland Gap and Mammoth Cave. Yes, and that was in the paper. But Monk Estill was one of the first men, white or black, that could make gunpowder in the state of Kentucky. And he was early with some of the early explorers leading the way and coming through. And part of my Nicodemus committee has found evidence, because they're descendants of his, that during the colonial time, he was really the one in Kentucky that was making the gunpowder. So he came through Scott County. He's left descendants that lived in Scott County. Also, with that, I want to talk about the churches. My church, which is no longer open, unfortunately, we had to close it due to a lot of our members passing away, was First Baptist Church's stamping ground. First Baptist Church stamping ground was organized in 1855 as a part of the famous traveling church with the Craigs and the Threckles and all those wonderful people who came from Virginia to seek the religious freedom in the late 1700s. They brought their slaves with them. The slaves in stamping ground were members of the Stamping Ground Baptist Church when good old Elijah Craig founded it there in Stamping Ground. It was the first pastor. Then, like I said, in 1855, we were given permission to have our own separate worship services. That rings so hard with me because I grew up in that church. And when I got older, being the church clerk, I read that church history every year at church anniversary. But to put it in perspective, before the end of slavery, Black people were able to have their own churches in Scott County, in Stamping Ground. Georgetown, First Baptist Georgetown is also an early African American church. Pete Vinegar, well-known early Baptist African American preacher, was part of the people that came with the traveling church. So that's how early the roots of the African Americans come, because Monk Estill's with the first explorers. You have the slaves that come with the people of Virginia with the famous traveling church. There were freed Black people in Scott County early. Most of them lived along Water Street because the livery stables and the businesses and the shops, wagon places, you know, they were doing the wagon wheels and different things. They occupied a lot of Water Street in downtown. And another church is Zion Baptist. It's not as early as First Baptist. You have Mount Olive in Georgetown that has a long history. Zion Hill, the hamlets had their own churches. There's a wonderful church. It's newer, but if you're talking about the older churches that aren't moved, First Baptist is not on Jefferson Street when they founded it. They're up here on 25. Zion Baptist is still on Mulberry. Mount Olive is still over there on Chambers Avenue. I belong to Wayman Chapel AME now. I grew up a Baptist my whole life. Joined AME Church when our church closed because we had to close it. I don't see a difference. The same songs we sung at First Baptist Stamping Ground are the same songs we sing over here at Wayman Chapel AME. But the AME Church in itself is quite historic. It's one of the earliest African American organized religions in the nation. Wesley Chapel is right behind us. That's an old church. But the Christian church that used to be active on Chambers Avenue, you have Mount Olive right there at Chambers and Bourbon. You go up a little bit, you have the Christian church, and then you go up a little bit further, you have Wayman Chapel, AME. So we know religion is a big part of our county's existence, but it's also, like I said, white, Black, whatever. It's also a big part of the African American experience in Scott County. There's a church, we may be in the vicinity of where there was a church in the early 30s. House of God, Holy Church of the Living God, Pillar and Ground of Truth. It was a long name. But that church was on Main Street in Georgetown. I would love to know where it is because Stamping Ground has a famous worldwide bishop that grew that church into a worldwide organization. Bishop Simon P. Rawlings. He was born in Stamping Ground, and I don't have the year, but Simon P. Rawlings came to church at, I'm going to refer to it as Mother Fane's church instead of the big long name. One night, a friend of his from Lexington suggested they visit Mother Fane's church here on Main Street in Georgetown. The friend was Marvin Gaye Sr., the father of the infamous singer Marvin Gaye Jr., whose father shot the son, but we won't go into that here. But Simon P. Rawlings came to Mother Fane's church here in Georgetown, and it touched him. He became baptized, he joined, she had a daughter around his age, they got married. He became the second in charge of the church. Eventually, he took over the church. She died, he remarried. They went to different places. He came back in Lexington, in the big white building on Georgetown Street in Lexington, the House of God. That's part of Simon P. Rawlings' empire of churches. That's like the headquarters for the world of his churches. He went throughout the United States and built the Church of God, House of God. He had several in Africa and different places, and that family is still running that church in Lexington. But Bishop Simon P. Rawlings was from Stamping Ground, Kentucky, and founded churches worldwide. That's the revival. I have notes, but so I want, like I said, my work has been cut out for me. That's why, I was upset we couldn't have the tour, but I was kind of relieved because that gave me time to find out more information of where these sites were. So that's very sacred, and I feel like if we can find it out, we definitely need to tour some of the churches when we do plan the tour. Lodges. There were several African American lodges in Scott County. Most of them were started by U.S. colored troops that came back here after the war, and they started them as benevolent societies, trying to bring the Black community together, educate, support, teach you different things. And there was a Knights of Pythias, and a lot of people only associate that with white lodges, but there is an African American branch of the Knights of Pythias. Several well-known members. I think Jerome Redfern owned the building that they met upstairs or something, if my memory serves me correct. Okay, I'm looking at Dr. Apple. And then the Oddfellows was in Georgetown. Stamping Ground, and I just found this out recently, we had 2 African American lodges. All my life I grew up and I heard we had 1, but there was actually 2 African American lodges in Stamping Ground. And with the lodges, the one in Stamping Ground that I know definitely existed for years, I do have some of their old programs with some of the names of the people and what they did. And I mean, they were full-fledged lodges. They did the formal dress, they did the programs, the outreach, and it was just amazing to me that history omits different things. And I think that on this journey that I'm going through for a reason, I feel like God put me here to do this, not to work with children as I do and have been doing for almost 20 some years. I'm here for history. And I'm here because, like I said, people are more alike than different. So if we have a chance to learn different people's history, that helps us as people today, living in a world where we live together, to learn more about each other. The launches. Oh, and most of all, I'm proud of everything that comes out of Stamping Ground, Scott County. I'm most proud of the U.S. colored troops that served in the Civil War. Those African American men from Scott County were some of the most influential soldiers in the Civil War. Do you all know we have several African American U.S. colored troops that served in the Civil War that are buried in Scott County that were at Appomattox Courthouse when Lee surrendered. Lee surrendered. Black men from Stamping Ground, New Zion, Georgetown, they're either in the 116th Infantry or the 114th Infantry. Juneteenth, Harrison Bradford, African American soldier. I have my researcher find it out more on him. I do know he was definitely a Buffalo soldier because he was killed in Texas. She thinks he may have been a U.S. colored troop as well because a lot of the Black Civil War soldiers re-enlisted to go out west to fight in the Indian Wars. But Harrison Bradford, his death is one of the main reasons Juneteenth is celebrated today from Stamping Ground, Kentucky. He was a Buffalo soldier and his unit went to San Antonio, Texas. After the end of the Civil War, there was some racial injustice going on at the Army base. The proud Scott County man stood up for justice and ended up being shot and killed. The city of San Antonio, Texas, in August of that year, started celebrating Juneteenth. Now, what more proud could anybody be from Scott County to realize men that helped build this county, who fought for their own freedom, who were free, that now live to commemorate a celebration of people being free. Those men that served in the 116th that was mustered in at Camp Nelson, there's over 400, I think it's 400, men that were in the U.S. colored troops from Scott County, fighting for their freedom, something that they months before probably had no idea that they would be put on the spotlight. And they rose to the occasion because they rose to the occasion in Revolutionary War. I have a researcher in Atlanta that's tying a lot of the Cour d'Afrique to Royal Springs, Valley Forge, different battles, Scott County men, Boston. Terry Thomas and I may disagree, but we'll agree to disagree. My friend in Atlanta with her doctorate degree and her 2 master's degree says that a lot of the men that fought with, I think it was George Washington from Boston, came down and helped build up Royal Springs and the city of Georgetown. She's one of those that she'll put 2 or 3 things together. but until she officially declares it, she's going to make sure her I's are dotted and her T's are crossed. The heritage of many of the African Americans in Scott County are the same heritage of a lot of the white Virginians that made that famous traveling church trek. There was a lot of openness in different race relationships earlier. It tended to change later, but there are a lot of early Georgetown families that are blood related to a lot of the Scott County African American families. And that's been going on since time, I believe. But the heritage of the African Americans in Scott County is just not one area, or you can go to one church, or you can visit this church and that church. The heritage of the African Americans in Scott County is vast because, like I said, we had the Johnson family that owned plantations up and down the Mississippi River, that had slaves go up and down the Mississippi River. I'm co-founder of the African American Genealogy Group of Kentucky. We have members worldwide that Zoom every third Saturday because they can trace an ancestor back to Kentucky. I have people that email us. My great-grandfather was born in Scott County, da 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 da. So the heritage of all Scott Countyans reaches throughout the whole world. And it's so wonderful to be able to present some tidbits of the history of some of the African Americans, because talking with African American genealogists, African American historians, we weren't the victors, so to say. So our story was never really preserved. Our story was never told. We just had bits and pieces. But that's enough to establish cultural identity and the history, like I said, that goes along with any other race that's in Scott County. And we're more inclusive, and we want to be more inclusive. That's why I felt like it, I feel like I have to educate, but also present, because a lot of the history is not known. And, if you're a genealogist and you're doing history and you're taught history in a history book and you don't see another culture's history, you're not going to learn about that culture. But we need to open up and share and really embrace each other's culture, because that's who we are today. But I'm not going to go into more of that, because I plan to go into more of that next Thursday when I'm back here at the museum dinner. But a history not preserved is a history lost. And we as historians, members of a historical society, we broaden our minds and we grow the more we learn about other cultures. But thank you all. If I bored you, I'm sorry, but I don't have fancy overhead. I didn't have great pictures, because like I said, when we do, and we will, get this tour together, I want you to come and step ground on some of these sites, because it would really just, fill you with a certain Scott County pride. So, but thank you all for having me. I appreciate the invite, and I look forward to you all again, and we will get that tour together.